Let me now, if I may, introduce Dr. William Lane Craig. He is a research professor at Talbot School of Theology, earned a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham in England before taking a doctorate in theology at the University of Munich. He is well known for the study of the resurrection, our topic tonight, and has authored over a dozen books, including The Historical Argument for the Resurrection of Jesus and Assessing the New Testament Evidence for the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus, as well as articles on the resurrection in New Testament Studies, the Journal for the Study of New Testament, and other journals. Please welcome Dr. William Lane Craig.
I want to begin by thanking Venue for sponsoring this important debate, and I want to say how honored I feel to be sharing the platform with Marcus Borg in particular. Dr. Borg is not only an esteemed New Testament scholar, but he's also a very nice guy, as you probably already can see. And I hope that nobody tonight will interpret my sharp disagreement with his position as in any way denigrating to his person. The discussion tonight is not about personalities, but about competing positions. It's not just about sharing those positions either, but about the reasons or the arguments in support of those positions. And in Dr. Borg's opening speech, we heard very clearly his position enunciated, but we didn't hear yet any evidence or argument in support of that position. And so I hope that in the course of the debate tonight, we'll hear more about his reasons for adopting the position he laid out. For my part, I'm going to defend tonight two basic contentions. First of all, that Jesus rose bodily from the dead in confirmation of his radical personal claims to divinity. And secondly, that if Jesus did not rise bodily from the dead, Christianity is a delusion which no rational adult should believe. Let's look at that first contention together then, that Jesus rose bodily from the dead in confirmation of his radical personal claims to divinity. Most New Testament critics today agree that the historical Jesus deliberately stood and spoke in the place of God himself. The German theologian Horst Georg Pohlmann reports, "Today there is virtually a consensus that Jesus came on the scene with an unheard of authority, namely the authority of God, the authority to stand in God's place and speak to us and bring us to salvation." Jesus' radical personal claims are blasphemous if they are not true. But the earliest followers of Jesus gave a good reason for thinking his claims to be true, namely his resurrection from the dead. Tonight I want to share with you 4 facts about the historical Jesus which are widely accepted by New Testament historians and which together provide inductive evidence for his resurrection. In his book, The Meaning of Jesus, Dr. Borg argues that if any event in Jesus' life is attested by at least 2 independent sources, one of which is early, then that event ought to be accepted as historical. He writes, "The logic is straightforward. If a tradition appears in an early source and in another independent source, then it is unlikely to have been made up." But it's relatively easy to show that all 4 of the key facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus have independently attested early sources, and therefore by Professor Borg's own criterion ought to be accepted as historical. Fact number 1. After his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Researchers have established the fact of Jesus' entombment on the basis of evidence such as the following. 1. The burial story was part of a very old source used by Mark in writing his gospel. Behind Mark's story of Jesus' suffering and death lies an earlier source, which included the story of Joseph's laying Jesus' corpse wrapped in linen in a tomb late Friday afternoon. Mark is the earliest of our Gospels, and so his source is even earlier still. In fact, the commentator Rudolf Pesch dates this source to within 7 years of Jesus' crucifixion. 2. Jesus' burial is independently attested in the very old information handed on by Paul. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. This information has been dated to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. The second line refers to Jesus' burial. Comparison of this 4-line formula to the gospel narratives on the one hand and the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles on the other reveals that the second line is a summary in outline form of the story of Jesus' burial in the tomb. And thus in Mark and Paul we discover extremely early independent evidence of Jesus' burial. 3. As a member of the Jewish high court that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the Jewish leaders who, in Christian eyes, had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. And thus, according to the late New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, Jesus' burial by Joseph is very probable, since it is almost inexplicable why Christians would make up a story about a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right by Jesus. For these and many other reasons, most New Testament critics concur that Jesus was in fact buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number 2. On the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons that have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following. 1. The empty tomb story is also part of Mark's very old source material. Mark's source didn't end with Jesus' burial, but with the empty tomb narrative, which is tied to the burial account verbally and grammatically. And thus we have very early attestation of the fact of the empty tomb. 2. Mark's account of the empty tomb is multiply and independently attested by other sources. Dr. Borg assumes that the only primary source we have for the empty tomb is Mark's gospel. But this is almost certainly wrong. Matthew and John have independent sources about the empty tomb. It's also mentioned in the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles, and it's implied by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:4. According to the eminent biblical critic Klaus Berger, the reports about the empty tomb are related by all 4 Gospels and other writings of early Christianity in a form independent of one another. We have a great abundance of reports which have been separately handed down. And thus we have multiple independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb. 3. The tomb was probably discovered empty by women. In Jewish society, the testimony of women was regarded as so unreliable that according to Josephus, they were not even permitted to serve as witnesses in a Jewish court of law. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples, like Peter and John, discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women rather than men who are the chief witnesses to the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was a rather awkward and embarrassing fact. Now I could go on, but I think enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist on the resurrection, and I quote, "By far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb." Fact number 3. On different occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact which is virtually universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars for the following reasons. 1. The list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul, guarantees that such appearances occurred. The old formula quoted by Paul goes on to say, "Then he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, he appeared also to me." Given the early date of this information, as well as Paul's personal acquaintance with the people involved, such appearances cannot be dismissed as merely legendary. 2, the appearance narratives in the Gospels provide independent multiple attestation of the appearances. For example, the appearance to Peter is attested by Luke and Paul. The appearance to the 12 is attested by Luke, John, and Paul. The appearance to the women is attested by Matthew and John. The appearance narrative spans such a breadth